We are joined this evening by Piper Hale, hazelnut grower and founder of Mount Adams Hazelnut Receiving Station near Yakima, Washington. Piper, thank you for sharing your experiences with us tonight. That must be the family.
Okay, yeah, so it's just a snapshot we took after a long day of work. We're not exactly at our best, but this is myself on the right, and then my mother, my nephew that helps out on the farm now, and my father who just recently passed away, and then the kids there out front are my kids, and so it's just kind of we're the operators of it. That's standing in front of our drying room currently.
So a family affair, certainly. How wonderful.
Yeah.
Piper, there's a lot of neighbors that I have that think I'm absolutely crazy for growing hazelnuts because I'm in the land of corn and soybeans. It looks like you all out there are growing all sorts of different things. So, was hazelnuts a natural selection? Tell me a little bit about that.
No. All right. So a little brief history. So we are in technically we're in the lower Yakima Valley, but in the Yakima Valley, Washington State, well known for growing apples. Of course, a lot of people know Washington State apples, and that's a lot of them come from our area. We're also known for hops. We grow some of the best and most hops anywhere else in the world. So we grow almost a large variety of crops, a lot of vegetable crops, juice grapes, wine grapes. It's a great region for growing wine grapes. Um, Hazelnuts was not considered one of it. We're technically like USDA cold hardiness 5. And so, we could see some pretty cold temperatures. And so when asked, when we were kind of early on checking into this, it was one gentleman, his name was Jim Canaday, that he was doing a lot of traveling to California and Oregon and saw these hazelnuts and the things were taking off. And he thought this would be something we should try here. And so he, had a test row. And then when he met me, I had a lot of experience with just the history of different hazelnut trees around the whole valley. And we found some that were 50, 60, 70 years, 80-year-old trees, just really old stuff. So we knew they can grow here, but we didn't know how well they would produce here. And so we kind of jumped into it and started planting trees and started with acreage, and more people have more acreage, and here we are today. So it's been about 11 or 12 years since that kind of all started. This orchard you're looking at right now in the picture, it's a Yamhill variety, and that's our family orchard right there. It's only about 10 acres of this one, and it's on this will be 7th leaf, so it's this will be the 7th season that we pick coming up for it. Something to note is what it is important, I guess, we'd stress, and we are far from getting all the answers figured out. But when people said we couldn't grow them here, it was too cold, and we can. We're showing that we're actually getting some decent. We're not expecting to get the same yields per acre per se, but we're going higher density, and that's another thing they all laughed at us about. It's like, you can't do that, and we're kind of doing it. So we're doing grape harvester. They didn't think that was possible. We're doing that too. But so we're not trying to get maybe as high yields, but we're trying to do it with no input. So we can grow things here organically really easy. We don't have, because I forgot to mention that, we're effectively a desert. Everything we grow, we have to water. So, which is really an important point to make, because we do not get any of the blight that is wiping everything out on Oregon, the eastern filbert blight. There's a few bugs that we don't get, some other pathogens. So currently right now we spray for nothing. And not to say that we won't get, bugs and filbert worm and things like that later on, but there's certain things we're not seeing it, and we don't really think we're going to see it. And so that's why we're angling towards that organic part. But what we are finding that it's pretty, I think it's going to be important, is trying to get, for us and something for you guys to consider too, is the whole, when do things pollinate? And there's certain varieties of nuts that are meant to be later in the year for harvest versus earlier. And all the new varieties that they're growing or developing between OSU or Rutgers or whoever's developing this stuff, they're actually trying to get stuff to harvest earlier in the season to beat the fall rains. because it gets so muddy they can't harvest in the fall. Well, we're the exact opposite. We don't care. We don't get the fall rains. We can be completely dry. So we actually want one that's later. And so we're doing some research into trying to find some of these older varieties that they don't like anymore, and maybe trying to develop some of that, because then that takes us out of the early frost window and it makes it more, I think we're going to find that they're more frost hardy, because so far this last year we did lose a little bit to frost, but it's so we're still trying to work through that. But that when they're ready to harvest and when they're coming into bloom are some real critical things that I think need to be looked at a little bit further. Yeah, we've actually and we're still experimenting with it. We're actually doing some artificial pollination, and so we're doing that currently. We're actually putting, there's one individual here that's actually putting quite a bit of effort into that, and pollen harvest and all sorts of things dealing with pollination. But I think the critical component that needs to go along with that is that just certain varieties will develop and elongate their catkins and push flowers earlier than other varieties. Ennis, for example, is going to be later in the blooming, but early and also later in the harvest. It's an older variety. Yamhill typically will be earlier. So it's more susceptible to frost, which is why last year we got a little bit nipped on it. So
Okay.
there's something to that. I think that's not all varieties are created equal.
You mentioned earlier, Piper, planting densities. Give me a feel for what sort of densities you're talking about there.
Okay, so this orchard that you have on the screen right now, that is, so how we arrived at that is Yamhill we already knew was a small tree. OSU developed that tree to be blight resistant. Turns out it's moderately blight resistant. I think it still can get it. But anyway, it's a small tree. They say maximum height in that tree is like 8 feet. And so when we did it, we were in the middle of taking out some Concord juice grapes, and we use the same exact row spacing for that, so that we're 10 feet apart for where the tractors grow, the row width, and then we space the trees 8 feet down the line. So every 8 feet on the row, there's a tree. Now, other people have done 4 foot, but they're using larger trees, Ennis, McDonald, whatever. And so the whole idea is that we're going to try doing annual hedging on every opposite sides of the tree, different things like that, to try to keep these trees small. Not everybody is using that type of harvester. There's been other methods that we're kind of playing with using nets. The nets will be collected in a net below the tree. That's a whole other conversation. But so there's multiple variations that we're trying to work on how to harvest it. But pretty much uniformly, almost everybody's doing a much higher density planting than a traditional Willamette Valley planting.
And when you have these plants that you're putting in, are they readily available? Is plant material any sort of a problem or a bottleneck for you?
Well, right, and that's why we have some growers that are develop their own nursery stock. Having nursery stock here locally available instead of trying to get it out of Oregon, because they are like 2 months different in time frame when they're ready to dig and plant the trees. So for instance, our trees came from Oregon originally, but we had to keep them in cold storage rooms and everything else because our ground was not ready to work yet. And so it was very difficult. You get higher loss, everything else. And so, yeah, the guys that are growing trees here, that's why we're only growing a few different varieties, not a wide gamut of different selections. But that might change as we figure out some things a little bit better. But right now there's a lot of benefit to growing them right next to where we're trying to plant them.
Piper, share with me just a little bit about what other crops you have to compete with. So you said you can grow many different things where you're at there. How does hazelnuts how did one go from grapes to hazelnuts? Is it just that hazelnuts are that profitable, or is there other things going on? Share a little bit about with that.
Sure. So, well, it was about 7-8 years ago, or more than that. It was about 8 years ago when we planted our our hazelnut trees, but it was about 8, 9 years ago when we were kind of toying with the idea. And at that time, juice grape prices were down, as they have been for decades, and apple prices were down. And our farm, we grow grapes, apples. We have some open ground. We'd grow like alfalfa, corn, beans, potentially no soybean, but like pinto beans or red beans, or something like that. Wheat, those kind of crops. That's what we grow here. Other growers in our region, or hazelnut growers in our region, they might be cherry growers, or a lot of them are apple growers. And what there's actually a lot of people don't realize in like the Willamette area, for instance, and perhaps you guys as well, like apples are a super labor intensive crop. It takes labor for pruning. You have to have crews go through in the spring for pruning, and then after that you have to have crews go through for thinning, thinning the apples out, all parts of the year. And then you got big crews come in for harvest, lots of labor. And so, as we all know, with things that are going on, labor's a big issue. I don't care what crop it is. If the more labor you have in a crop, the worse it is. So for us, that was what we were trying to find, something that wasn't real labor intense, and for us, something that we could potentially. That's why I gravitated towards this whole idea of the mechanical grape harvester, is we can use our existing equipment. That's why we made the leap into it. Other people are making the leap because they want something that's not apples. Quite frankly, they're apples. It can be very volatile. You might put a variety in that's a big winner one year, and then 2 years, 3 years later, you have to take a bulldozer and pull them out again. And it's very common for that to go on here. So hazelnuts, as far as input required, it would be very similar if you are from if you have any growers that are growing any kind of juice grape. It very low input. The pesticides, the fertilizers, or the lack thereof, I should say, is very similar to what we use for juice grapes. It's nowhere near the intensity of apples. Apples, then on top of the labor issue, then you're consistently spraying, dormant oils and thinning agents and all sorts of fungicides and insecticides and all sorts of different things if you're going, it's nearly impossible to go organic. Some guys do organic, but most apples grown around here are all conventional, and the inputs are just through the roof. So hazelnuts, for us and everyone that's kind of glommed onto this idea to see if it's going to work, is looking for something that they can maybe do it with a father son, or one or two people, and a limited amount of equipment. And so we're seeing a lot of people doing 2, 3, 4, 5 acres at a time, just because they have 5 acres they don't know what to do with, and they don't want to have to put in something that takes a lot of maintenance. So that's the long answer. There's 3, 4, 5 of us that are really making a huge effort trying to figure some of this stuff out, and because of that effort, it takes a little bit. It I think takes the ease of mental pain, anguish off some of these other growers trying to do it.
You on that theme. So how is it set up? How does a grower get access to information? Is there a growers group, either formal or informal? Is it really you and just a handful of individuals? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So we developed, it's an Eastern Washington Hazelnut Association. No, we do not have a website yet. But we developed this organization to basically, our whole thing is to gain knowledge and be able to have the resources to educate other growers and try to develop this industry from nothing. And it's actually working, because not to sound a little bitter about it, but it wasn't even until this year that we're even getting any university to even acknowledge our existence. I've had more support from the Michigan group personally, or contact wise at least, than I can get from Washington State University, which is my alma mater. And when I've reached out to them to say, hey, we're trying to, we could use some help developing some of this, or looking into research for this, because there's no data, there's no research for what we're doing in our area. And the response we get back is, well, you guys aren't large enough. There's not enough money there's not enough, crop. There's not enough. It's just like you're too small. So we've been trying to develop this whole industry in our area, and I think this coming spring there's going to be over 1,000 acres going in the ground. So we'll be over 1,000 acres total, and every year it's a couple hundred more or whatever. It's growing kind of fast, and we're developing that, and we're trying to get that information out to growers and figure out some of these alternatives without the resource, without that resource. And so it's been a group effort, but doing that, developing this organization, we've been able to put on pretty regular annual tours for the last 4 or 5 years, summer tours, and then winter meetings. And and I think we're getting good information putting out to people, and anything we learn, we try to pass that on to everybody. And so, for those risks we mentioned, we're trying to minimize those risks as much as possible, or at least educate people about what those risks are, and so they realize what they're getting into.
So operationally, tell me a little bit about how you go about growing. So you mentioned that you're putting hazelnuts into former grape rows. You have trees that aren't getting more than 8 foot tall. Is that kind of a threshold for the grape harvester? How do you handle those bigger trees? Can the harvester handle that volume of mass? Fill me in there a little bit.
So yeah, our harvester is developed sometime around the time of Moses, so it's not very well adapted to the larger tree. We are the only ones growing Yamhill currently, and we have about 20 acres of. Everyone else is growing like Ennis or McDonald, Sacagawea. And there's a few other people that are using like cherry harvesters, or which is basically a large grape harvester. But they are more fit for like up to maybe 10 feet tall trees. And again, the people that are planning on doing that, they will be doing hedging, because they're dealing with a tree that's meant to be a lot larger, and you've got to keep it down. One thing we're finding, because we're in a much hotter climate, we're seeing some pretty high temperatures in regularly in the summer. In our growing season, we think the trees kind of get stunted to that a little bit, and they just don't grow as tall as they do in Oregon.
I'd love to know more about how you go about harvesting and processing.
Okay, so this is one of our first kind of substantial harvest that we did a couple of years ago. It was 2 years ago, and this was a Yamhill variety, and we're using a Chisholm Rider grape harvester.
So this is a grape harvester.
Correct.
How does it work? Give me kind of the bigger picture. Is it stripping the trees?
No, it's impact feeder. So it's using a side-to-side motion, and that just literally shakes them off the branches.
Okay.
So what's interesting about this video, though, and that's why I sent this to you, if you want to pause it anywhere in there, what's important to note on this is that the leaves, we do have extraction fans on the machine, so it'll pull out leaves, but the majority of the leaves are attached to nuts. So it's critical. It's what we're finding is one of the more difficult aspects of harvesting early and harvesting green, is that you're almost by default will get a bunch of leaves on it.
So speaking of that, how do you know when they're ripe and ready to harvest to go through with the harvesters?
So when the shell's fully formed, it's usually, we try to time it right before the natural drop, but if we wait too long, then they start falling to the ground. So we typically will wait. Our timing, is pretty critical, I think. And we're probably a little too cautious on it in some ways, but you can pick them pretty green, and the nuts fully formed inside is just going to be green, and so it's going to take more it'll take more drying time to get the moisture out of it, or they also require a little bit of cure time. But the nuts fully formed, the flavor's fine, everything about it, it's so far really good. So these are European varieties that we're growing in our area. And again, these are yamhill trees that you're seeing in the background there. And all these European varieties that are grown in Oregon or in our area, Eastern Washington, actually we're more central Washington, is they'll fall naturally on their own as they become ripe. They will fall and land on the ground. And conventional harvest techniques, as you guys are probably aware of, is they sweep them and vacuum or whatever, they get them off the ground. And our ground is really rocky, and we already had the equipment for doing vineyard grapes, juice grapes, and so this really appealed to us, as we're doing the same spacing and everything as we do for grapes, and so we thought we'd try picking early. In fact, I think you guys or the Michigan initiative, they used a blueberry harvester about 1 year before we used a grape harvester. There's a lot of nuts that are when the impactors hit it are being released from the husk, and they're falling from, or being released from the husk, but there's still quite a few that are either in the husk or still attached to the leaves. So the pictures there that are in the bin, it's anywhere from 30 to 40% in mass, in weight. Actually, I think it's closer to about 40% in weight is just green matter. It's something other than the nut, and that's so that's way higher than you would ever have to deal with anywhere else on a conventional ground harvest. And so and the other thing we learned too, because it's green, you can't just let it sit there in a storage bin. It'll start heating up and having a little bit of a reaction take place. So it's critical to get those processed pretty soon.
So how long are the nuts holding on to these in this system here, holding on to the trees before they would fall to the ground? And then conversely, how much time do you have with the grape harvesters to be able to get in there and get the harvest done before you start seeing that stuff drop?
All right, so conventional harvest usually would take place. If a ground harvest, they might start. Again, we're different timing than what they are in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, but let's just say around it'd be like in the October timeframe. With the grape harvester, we were doing basically the end of August, 1st of September.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so essentially it was like a really good full month early. But again, we were trying to get it like, before anything falls, because there's some different philosophies on that. But the trouble is with the grape harvester, some people say, well, it'd be nice if we can go through there early and then like mid-season, late season. But I don't honestly think that's realistic. To me, it's just go through once, get them early and do it. So your window is kind of narrow. You have probably, there's probably a 3-week window, because if you wait too long and you get a windstorm and they're already really on the verge of falling naturally on their own, then they're going to fall, and then you've lost your crop. And then if, like our case in our orchard, we don't have a backup plan. We don't have ground harvesting equipment. So that would be, something, actually it's kind of interesting, falling back to what you guys are doing in the Midwest, your varieties, if that might, it's all about developing a market for it. But if we can, develop a market for it, if like where the native or the American species of hazelnut does not want to release, well, that would be great for grape harvester, because then you can hold it on for a much longer period of time, and then harvest a little bit more at leisure.
That's a fascinating point. And one of the things that I do keep track of with some of those plants that I think might be promising is, are these nuts falling from the cluster to the ground, or would the whole cluster potentially fall to the ground? Because I can harvest clusters. It's just real tough to harvest these little individual tiny marbles that we kind of grow here. So
well, you should try yamhills. They're like pea size. They're terribly small. But so no, if they're going to fall free, all the European varieties that we're familiar with that we grow here, they would naturally fall on their own. So between the wind and the shaking and all this, natural, they would just naturally fall to the ground without the husk. Now, obviously, some do fall with the husk, but it's probably in the neighborhood of 1% or less. So something interesting to note, back to the grape harvesting, how we do that. So the industry as a whole, if they're only seeing 1% of their crop that's still in a husk, well, when we do it, we're looking at about a 90, anywhere from probably 60 to 90% of the crops inside of a husk. And so that really changes the dynamics of your machinery that you have to use to try to get that off. And it was a crazy learning curve, but we really kind of, I think, worked our way through it pretty well. Okay, so this is at a place about an hour east of where we are. It's in the Kennewick area, and this grower has McDonald varieties and Sacagawea varieties and Ennis. I'm not sure what trees these are that we're harvesting at the time, but what we've been experimenting with using a ground geotech type fabric on the ground, so that way when the nuts start falling, they fall on the fabric and not on just bare open weed, dirt, rocks, everything else. And the effort is to keep them cleaner, and it really does seem to work pretty well. There's some issues we're trying to figure out, and that's why we're still kind of experimenting with it. One is cost, of course, but so this grower didn't really have an idea of how he was going to harvest when he put this down. He decided another grower in the area bought this brand new lovely harvester, and it works great off of bare ground. And this is the first time really trying it on top of this fabric. And so there's some issues with that, but it actually worked. I mean, more or less. I mean, we were leaving some, there was some issues with the drip line in the way and things like that. But overall, it was really successful. And so this harvester, I mean, he'd just fly through there, and it, the material that came off this fabric, exceptionally clean, and it worked pretty well.
So first question, when would you put down that geofabric? Is that what the term
right?
you
Some
used?
people are leaving it up year round and putting it close to or putting it down, in this like spring, basically leaving it around year round. And then there's some other people that just put it down, like say a month or 2 months before harvest. But like I said, not everybody is doing that technique. But for the people that have it, I mean, it seems to work pretty well. There's a few growers that are using like a vacuum style harvester, and that the fabric with that really works very well, because you can just use leaf blowers and vacuums and pick it up right off the tarp.
Is this fabric material durable? I mean, I see that the machine's driving over it, so obviously it has a certain level of durability to it. But is it something where if you leave it out there for a couple of months, will the sun get to it and break it down over a while? Does it have
No,
some
it's meant to be out year round. The manufacturer of this is called Extend-Day. So one of the other things we're really trying to do is optimize light in the orchard, because it's, to me, we are trying to grow light, not nuts necessarily. We can, if we get the lights in the tree or lights in the grow, that would be the best, right? Natural sunlight. And so we think we don't have any data to support it, of course, because we're kind of working through it as well. But we think that is going to add a benefit of just that reflected light off the fabric too.
Next question is, how is that fabric attached to the ground, so when those sweepers, they don't kind of sweep up the fabric then?
So I don't know. I can't remember exactly how this one is. If he's attaching it to a wire, some people have a wire down the middle, and then we're clipping it to the wire. Other people are using stakes or staples and putting it on the edges. This guy here is attaching it to a wire in the middle.
And again, this unit is a unit that would be used on bare ground, and you're really looking to just optimize it by including that geofabric to reduce sticks and dirt. And
yeah, he harvested off of bare ground as well. This one video is just off the tarp. Sure. And I mean, it was far from 100% effective, but it proved that it's potentially possible. What would be the takeaway from this? The learning part is the fabric needs to be well fastened down. There shouldn't be any drip lines, and basically just a smooth floor of that fabric would be really advantageous, I think.
So then even removing rocks and stuff like that would poke holes, or that would abrade that.
Correct. Okay. And that, so the people that leave it year round, they actually have weeds grow underneath it, because it kind of lets light through. It's not a weed barrier fabric like what you might be used to seeing it, in the landscape industry. But it, because it's white, things will grow underneath of it. So there's some cons to that too, right? If you're getting, it's like walking on a pillow all the time. The other issue that we have not seen, but may be of an issue, we're assuming it could be an issue, is rodents and things like that going on underneath the fabric. But the overall principle of nuts falling on fabric, not on dirty ground for food safety reasons, coming down the line in the future, we see really good benefits to this.
Piper, here in the Midwest, we have to husk our nuts. We're collecting them from the plant like you are there with harvesters, or picking them by hand. And then we have to do this husking process. What's it like for y'all?
Okay, so that was that was one of the largest and difficult things that we have, I mean, technically, I guess, still kind of working through, is husking. And number one reason is in Oregon, 1% of their crop has to go through a husker or less. And the crop that has to go through the husker is already dry, it's crispy. You just look at it and it falls out of the husk. So all they're essentially doing is they're just kind of gently tumbling it around, and it's dehusked and it goes back in their line with the rest of the nuts. Well, what we found instantly is we have leaves, we have sticks, and for the green side of it, for green harvesting. And in order to get those off without scratching them, we had to first off get rid of the leaves, get rid of the sticks, and then that are all connective tissue, that's still living tissue that's on this nut. And the husk is just like glued on with like Elmer's glue. It's just really difficult to get off. And so we developed a machine, or like a thrashing type machine, that is will strip that stuff off, and enough. What we'll do is we'll dry it down, have like a precondition it, and then we'll dry it down partially, and then we'll run it through again for a final time, and then we're golden at that point. But so that's why it was really difficult, because nothing in the industry, nothing in Europe is meant to handle that percentage of green stuck on hard husks without, in all their equipment. If we ran it through that, if we ran our that 90% of husks, the nuts that have 90% of them have a husk on it, if we run it through their typical dehusking machine, and we've bought some of those machines, it just is wildly violent to the shell. And so if you're trying to do an in-shell marketing to that nut, it doesn't work. It's just, it really damages the shell. So kernel market, that's fine. Kernel, obviously you can just destroy it and they don't care. But for in-shell market, we're trying to keep everybody happy on it, and was really a difficult thing to overcome.
If you had to estimate or guess how much of the crop would go towards in-shell versus some sort of a processing just to get to the kernel, what would you say?
Well, right now for us, because the one farm, Washington Hazelnuts, is that company. They are primarily dealing with kernels only, and they don't have any in-shell market. They're just starting to get in a little bit more of the in-shell market. I don't know what the percentages are, nationwide, or what it is in Oregon or anything like that. I mean, for us personally, what we're seeing, what we're running through our receiving station, we're probably like less than 1% right now is in-shell. Of course, COVID with China, that really changed all that too. So, I mean, there's going to be weird stuff on the horizon with all of this, but I just think it's important that we maintain it. For us, we had to maintain the viability of in-shell, because we have some small time farmers that only have a couple acres, and they're doing everything they're selling is going to a farmer's market, or they're doing some really boutique type packaging. And so they need a really nice product. And so we're trying to cater to that as well, and just keep options open. I mean, the whole, our goal is to try to be able to kind of help everybody out here on this. All right, so that picture there is, those are Ennis nuts. And right now, Ennis variety is an older variety, and it's primarily used for export or in-shell marketing. So that is the one on the right versus the one on the left. Is the one on the left, we sent it through a husker that's kind of more on the conventional. Like I said, they're only Willamette, Oregon area, maybe less than 1% of their nuts actually have to go through a dehusking machine. And when I send ours through that machine, it basically uses wire brushes and scrubs those right off of that. And it makes that nut basically unsellable for the in-shell kernel market. And so we had to develop proprietary machinery just to not scratch it. And because we have a few growers that really want to try to maintain that in-shell look. And if we're going to go green, we had to make some stuff that we can run a large volume through and not scratch them. And so it's something to be mindful of if you're going for an in-shell market.
Tell me about Mount Adams Hazelnuts, the name of your receiving station, and how all that came together.
Purchasing from a grower, a farmer in the Willamette area, a very old but had some life in it receiving station. So all the components, the trommel screens and things like that. And we moved it here, got everything going, and what we found is the first bin that we dumped into the receiving hopper, it wouldn't even go into the hopper because there's so much green mass, it just stuck there. And so that was like a huge wake-up call. Huge wake-up call that we knew we needed to do something for the following year. So every year on the receiving station, we just kind of had to find a problem, figure out how to overcome it. And Oregon's going through that right now. In fact, I would say they're not really adapting to it very fast, because there's the percentage of growers that are looking at doing grape harvesters right now is extremely small in the Willamette region. So they the few receiving stations I know that have even taken tree over the tree harvested material, they are still using conventional methods of trying to do it, and it's a choke point. It's really difficult to handle. So from the beginning, we just knew that we needed this whole separate line for it. And so what we did is I basically added another 50%, expanded onto our traditional receiving station just for green harvesting, just to handle the green material. And then if there's someone that's been harvested off the ground, we put that in the conventional side.
Piper, take me through the receiving process.
Okay, so this is actually the end of the line of our wash line. So the idea is we dump hazelnuts in it, and this was from this year. Excuse me. And so everything we ran this year was ground harvested, not tree harvested this year. So I just took this real quick video. This is basically what's coming off of the last process, which is a derocking tank. And that's the clean finished product right there. Variety, I'm not sure what it is. And then these other trommels are either rinse trommels, wash trommels, and then we're headed back over to kind of this is our input tank where everything gets put in. And then so this over here is where we're trying to separate sticks and rocks and everything else. And coming back and around, this is the sticks and rocks and trash and blanks. We also take a lot of the blank nuts out. So like you might see some hazelnuts in that bin, but they're all blanks.
And all of those different trommels are different screening, sizing trommels to just eventually narrow them down to the different sizes. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So again, this machinery, if you compare it to anything that's new in Willamette, it's not, it's almost an embarrassment, but we actually added some things that you would not see anywhere in Oregon that is completely different. We just kind of had to develop ourselves for the stuff we were dealing with. But yeah, I mean, this is what we have for now, but it works pretty well for what we're doing. And if you were to compare this to we visit some brand new facilities that people have put in the Willamette area, this would be pretty small in comparison. But we're not anywhere near there yet for volume. But we, before we get, every year we're going to probably double or triple in volume, and so we have to be ready for that as that comes in.
Give me a sense of the size and scale of what you're doing now and what your projections are.
So currently there's probably anywhere from 600 to 800 acres in the ground. And now, will we see all of that? We're the only receiving station. That's why we put this in the first place, is to be able to offer growers kind of a local venue to handle this. Because like I said earlier, If you use a grape harvester for harvesting hazelnuts, it comes in green, and they really need to be handled quite quickly, or figure out some way to let them air dry. And so we knew we needed something here without having to, our only other options, you truck them 5 hours west to the Willamette area and try to get them dried and everything else there. Well, that's a lot of trucking. And especially if you're trucking nuts that are 40% by volume already water and leaves. So that's a bunch of weight we don't need to take down there. So that's why we put this in, and it was to manage that locally. So with say if there's 800 acres in the ground right now, not all of that's in production. I think only there might be 200 acres in production, something like that, currently. And this last year was really an off year. We had a really weird frost, but so we ran through our wash line this year a little over 50,000 pounds in clean hazelnuts. I believe it was around that point. So it's pretty small, but it's way more than what we did last year and way more than we did the year before. So the whole point is that every year we know there's going to be more coming. We know, in fact, we know what our capacity is roughly. We could probably handle 3 to 4 million pounds a year, and we're just trying to get everything perfected. So when it does show up, we're ready for it.
And where would the nuts go from here?
I wasn't able to find pictures of any of that, but essentially we're just using those bins right there. Those are actually old grape bins that we used to use in grape harvest. And we put ventilated bottoms in those, and then we set them on a plenum dryer. So it's basically just a long tube or a structure that we put forced air and heat into, and then we dry them down to about 8-9% moisture.
And then will they just be stored in the bins for long-term storage?
So from there, we don't. So we're not the quote unquote processor. We're just the mid-step handler for cleaning, drying process, right? So we, and this would kind of following what they're doing in the Willamette area. This is very traditional, the way it's handled. And so once we're done with them, we put them in super sacks, so those large tote, fabric bags.
Yep.
And then we send them to another grower / processor, and they do marketing and different things with them. Excuse me. So we take it to him after we're done with it. One thing to note too, and we haven't gone into this is a whole separate topic of conversation, is we are actually certified organic on our line. And we're one of only maybe a couple certified organic receiving stations anywhere in the world, for that matter. So and we're really trying to get all our growers to go organic, and that's kind of our niche. Is we want to have basically everything we handle to be organic.
You mentioned organic, and you have a lot of growers that make sense to go organic, where you're at, the way that you can grow the crop. Have you seen any sort of either premium or market demand associated with organic, that it's worth it to go to that step to produce organic and be certified?
Well, first off, it's in our area, if you don't grow organic, you got a hole in your head. You just absolutely need to do it, because there's just the risk versus reward is there's just not enough risk for it. Again, the worst thing we have to overcome is suckering. So if you can get over the suckering issue, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to not go organic. Right now, right now, hazelnut prices are in the toilet. They're some of the lowest prices we've seen in decades. And I'm not even one that follows it that much, but right now, I know out of Oregon, like Ennis, I think it's like 43 cents or something like that a pound. I mean, it's like
for the farmer at the farm gate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's for conventional nuts. That's what he's going to get for his nuts after all the work he's done. And so it's very, very low right now. Well, with organic, you're looking at 2 to 3 times that price. Well, actually more than that. I mean, it's like, I think $1.60 to $1.80, something like that.
Okay, nice.
I'm sure I'm off on it, but it's in that dollar something, $1.60, $1.80 price range for sure.
Yep.
There is starting to be some organic production out of Oregon, but it is, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for those guys that are trying to do it. The amount of pest pressures and things that they have to deal with are immense. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hand work. It's and I mean, I can't remember how many acres they have down there that's in production, but I'm pretty sure we're, probably another year or two, we'll probably eclipse everything that's growing organic in Oregon, just in our little area. So we're again, I don't want to sound boastful by any means. We are still small potatoes. We're small acreage. We're nothing compared to what they're doing in Oregon. And we definitely don't have all the answers. But what we can do is we can grow organically, and that alone, we're trying to just develop that as a super high quality nut that's organic. And if we can pull that off, that's great, because right now the world supply of organic is so low that companies like Kellogg or whoever, and some aren't even interested in it because there just hasn't been a supply yet. They haven't even developed a product because there's no organic available. And what is organic, unless it's coming from Oregon or in the United States, when it comes out of Turkey, it's very questionable what is organic. It's organic with usually an asterisk at the end of it. And so if we can develop that here, then that will hopefully, and we get enough tonnage available, then that will give possibly some of these larger buyers enough in the supply chain to look at developing organic product.
Tell me about some of the greatest challenges that you faced.
Okay, so let's just start with the growing and the propagation of them. So the challenge is what we're seeing with growing them is probably suckers is the greatest challenge, and trying to figure out how to manage suckers. We've done everything from manual pruning them out with loppers to flaming to some other sorts of mechanical whips and things like that, trying to get them out. Suckering is probably the worst in our area, what we're fighting against. In order to stay organic and not use a lot of harsh chemicals to do it, suckers is probably the number one issue that we're dealing with. Pest, disease, there's no pressure on that at the moment. The marketing, I guess the cleaning and drying part of it, I mentioned those obstacles already, is how to figure out how to take how to deal with the green harvest, and that was a whole foreign thing. And I think we're kind of working our way through that. We kind of have those answers. Either we have the answers or we know what the recipe is going to be to make that answer. And so the last part of it would be the marketing. The marketing aspect of it right now is because we're trying to do organic, is to get enough of them. We can't, and I'm not the authority in this matter. There's another individual that kind of handles this, but they have buyers, they want product, but we have to be able to get them enough product.
Shifting gears just a little bit now, are any growers grazing animals in their hazelnuts?
Interesting. I'm all for it. I think that would, I haven't tried it yet, but I think sheep potentially would be a great additive, or whatever you want, a component to the orchard to get suckers. I think it would be great. I've also thought chickens would be another one to get bugs, like in our apple orchards. But here's the thing: global gap and all this food safety stuff, you're not allowed to do it, which is ridiculous. That's a whole other topic. But I think animals are great. I think it would be a benefit to the orchard. I think because they're, with hazelnuts, they're up in the tree, they're safe, they're not going to be anywhere near a sheep. We're especially if we're using a grape picker to pick them, they're never coming in contact with the soil or any stuff there. So I think that's one green light advantage to us with the over the tree concept. But yeah, I think there's something to be said for that. There has been some the people that do the marketing, the Washington hazelnut side, they are that family, they grow blueberries, and he's been experimenting putting hazelnut trees in blueberry rows. And I think that might be genius. I don't know how, what the current status of that is, but if you could use a machine to come in and harvest blueberries, and then that would be earlier in the year, and then come back later in the year when the blueberries are all done and you can harvest the tree. I mean, that's best of both. The trees providing shade for the blueberries, and so something like that is potentially a great idea. Something for us. We do a grass cover crop down the middle. If you had technically had some sort of harvesting equipment or forage, harvest, like carrots or uh, something down the middle, you might be able to do that. Take smaller equipment. Really, we have an irrigated 10-foot row that we're currently just mowing and trying to make the best soil possible in that 10 feet. But there's definitely room for other crops for animals or something like that. The animal thing, I think you'd have to, because of food safety stuff, it would probably be your biggest hurdle that you wouldn't allow you to do that.
So how soon after planting can you expect nuts?
Usually year 4, there's something to kind of point and look, hey, we got some nuts. Maybe we actually harvested ours in year 4, but it was not worth harvesting, I'll say. And then year 5 and year 6 were where usually things are in better production.
Got it. Some of these varieties, Yamhill, Ennis, how long lived are they? Are you looking at a decade, 20, 30, 40 years? You'll replace a better variety with a worse producing one? How does that work?
You know, so my background is actually landscape architect and horticulture, but so I wear a few hats. But some of the trees that I've looked at in our valley were planted 100 years ago behind the barn of some homestead, or and so I know there's some old trees out there, old varieties that produce nuts. In Oregon, I know there's some farms that are 100-year-old farms. I don't know. I think some of their tree groves are potentially in that 50 plus to 100-year um, tree grows. What happened though, and my knowledge is limited, I don't want to say I'm an authority on this by any means, but what appears to have happened is when that EFB blight came through, a lot of these older orchards either got bulldozed, cut down, or reset to try to save the orchard. So some of these old orchards that used to be really beautiful are gone. I have not walked through a really ancient orchard. So I'll say this to answer that question. I think if your variety is doing well, everything I've seen, I think it's something that you potentially have for 50 to 100-year orchard, no problem. I mean, shoot, we have apple orchards that are 40, 50 years old, no problem here growing apples. So I would foresee which is actually not part of the norm around here, because now they all want these new varieties of root stocks and things like that. With the hazelnut, or the varieties, the ones that are tried and true, I think that'll be ones that potentially, if that you're going to see last generations, and we'll see how some of these new creations out of OSU will hold up to that.
Piper, any advice for growers here in the Midwest?
Variety development is going to be key. And one good thing I can see from you guys, at least it sounds like the university is really helping you, or helping your area a great deal, trying to develop, one or two. And even if it's not for in shell, that's fine. Kernel, it's all about flavor, getting a good. It's actually kind of even crazy that we're talking about flavor right now, because in years past, I think everyone kind of took that for granted, and these growers are just putting anything out in a brown shell, and it gets sold and bought, and it's a hazelnut. Well, now people are starting. I don't know if it's because of the different market influences, whatever, but now you hear rumors and whispering of, oh, flavor, yeah, that's important, and we don't want that variety over here, but we want this variety because this one tastes better. Well, that's very important, and so if you guys, in theory, were to develop some, it might be the ugliest thing you've ever seen, but it's got great flavor, and who cares on the size? That's all it takes, potentially, because the in shell market, truthfully, is kind of a very small market. Either it's a very it's a limited market. But so yeah, getting that variety. Now, the variety that you guys come up with, I guess the one thing is, if you guys been using blueberry harvesters versus what we are doing with a grape harvester, very similar. But I personally am trying to keep it to a tree shaped bush, because the catch pans on our harvester are about 18 inches off the ground. and it's very important to catch those nuts. And I know, talking to people, there's people in Oregon that do a bush style. They just let them grow natural, let the suckers come up, and they turn into a bush. And so they have trouble with trying to get those nuts to fall out of that stump of stubble. And I know you guys will too, unless there's a whole other kind of machine. Because the difference between a blueberry harvester and a grape harvester is basically a blueberry harvester is super gentle, and it's not meant to handle a lot of leaves, and it's not meant to handle a lot of big sticks, and everything's small on it. Where a grape harvester, everything's twice the size. So if you guys can get one of those or bigger, I think that would be one good step. And then if you're going to grow them in a bush, I'd probably still be looking at some way to cultivating those the bush crowns, or what do you want to call it? Try to keep those as narrow as possible so you can still blow or keep the nuts from getting entrapped into that. So one thing that I've mentioned to a number of growers is you grow the tree, or in your case bush, you grow the bush to fit the machine. And if you are going to have to be machine harvested, then you need to put effort into hedging, using mechanical trimmers and sickles or something. And it's interesting, when we started doing this 10 years ago, nobody pruned anything. And now, no, actually nobody pruned, nobody irrigated. And since then, both of those have been, oh yeah, those are both good ideas. We're finding out you get better yields with water, and you get better yields, growth rates with pruning. And so you guys will probably find those things out as well, with the pruning aspect of it, at least. So if by pruning them to get narrower hedges or keep the crowns narrower, it'll probably stimulate growth where you want it. So in our case, we prune the trees and try to get all the limbs that are growing into the row out and going along the row with the wire, for instance, so it's more linear. And the espalier comes to mind, like it's a French pruning term.
Yeah.
To try to train your tree to follow the shape. And so it takes more work, more effort, but I think long term, if you're going to try to grow a larger tree / bush or whatever, if it's large and you're trying to keep it shrunk down, you have to direct that growth somewhere. You just absolutely can't just try to keep it a midget without having that growth go somewhere else. And it's going to go in the places you don't want it if you try to keep it too small without having an avenue for it to release that extra growth.
Any other advice to growers?
So again, I guess what my advice would be is, first off, you're going to have what you might be battling is probably some of the same things we're battling. Is maybe, so we are not developing our own varieties, right? So we're just trying to copy paste what's been done in the past. We're taking some, right, like Ennis, for instance. One of the reasons we gravitated towards Ennis, because it was one that they were struggling with. It was one of the major nuts that China was buying for the in-shell market. It's a beautiful, great, tasty nut, great flavor, and they can't grow it there. So that was what we jumped all over. It's like, well, they can't grow it, we will grow it, and see if we can rejuvenate that variety, and maybe make that our thing. And so far it's working, right? But so as far as the struggle goes, and I know a little bit about what you guys are doing in your the Midwest region, is you're using your American varieties of hazelnuts that are have a ton of great characteristics to it. But what I lack the knowledge on is the marketing side of it. I don't know anything about that, except that I do know that if you are like Ferrero Rocher or some large buyer, they only want known varieties. And so but at the same time, OSU and these other places are developing new varieties, and then everyone's growing and planting them and developing them. And then they develop a channel for that new variety. And so like all things, you got to be able to have something that is known, recognizable, and able to be bought and sold, right? So I guess that would be my advice is, we all need to kind of work on, I think, this together potentially to figure out what that is. And that's why we're kind of lazy in the approach. We're just growing things that they already in the pipeline. You guys, that would be something that's going to be, I think, difficult to, figure out what that variety is, or, market that. and then consistency too. So one thing we're really striving for is quality and consistency. So it's something that'll be a well-known product. So if you guys are trying to develop something, figure out what that is, what that whatever variety is, and then and then really hone in on that. And I think you guys will probably have good success as well.
As our time together comes to an end, I have one final question. Do you have a favorite hazelnut recipe?
Oh, I don't. I so here's something too. I haven't got there yet, and I don't even probably want to have to record this not. But actually, one of the things that I want to try to develop in the United States is a cob nut.
Cob
COB,
nut.
cob nut. Every time I tell somebody that, what the heck's a cob nut? So it's a British thing. All it is, it's a green hazelnut. They market it, they sell it right around August, or actually October is when they typically, between October and Christmas, is when they seem to be the most in demand, and they'll refrigerate them and cool them. But they're a green harvested, still in the husk hazelnut. It's usually Ennis, or they call them Kentish from a county in England. But and it's actually kind of cool. And if you've ever eaten a green hazelnut, they almost have like a cucumber type, but they're kind of a crunchy green kind of texture to it. And anyway, so cob nuts, me personally, I'm actually going to try to do a little bit of pre advertising or something like that, and see, because when we use a grape harvest to harvest it, that's what we're doing. We're picking green hazelnuts. And if I could develop a market for green hazelnuts for the new kitchen trend or something like that, then that's like, I'm all over it. So I'm going to try doing that. That's my kind of my personal thing. It would be if I can get people to start eating green hazelnuts that aren't roasted. It's a whole other thing that another flavor that they haven't tried. I think would be kind of cool. And right now it's only a British thing. So if I can get that brought here, why not?
I can't thank you enough, Piper, for taking the time out of your schedule to fill us all in on how you all grow hazelnuts in Washington.
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, they are. This would be their 8th leaf this year.
So an 8-year-old plant?
Correct.
Okay. Next question. Are you training the cordons of these plants to fill the 8 space between the trunks?
Well, that was the original intent, but they grow so slow that we probably could have got by with adding another tree in between. But that was the original intent, is to develop a main limb or trunk that can be to fill that space.
You mentioned espalier, something similar to that, or am I off?
Correct.
Okay. So another question here from Les. How does the water requirement of hazelnuts compare to some of those other crops that you grow? And of course, water has become a problem for almond farmers in California.
So we are in a virtual desert, and if we don't give it water, things die. So the amount of precipitation that they get compared to like our vineyard crops, very similar. So it would be on par with Concord grapes, and it's probably less than apples for sure.
Okay, great, great. Oh, hey, another great question. So why do you control the suckers? Why not let them grow into bushes, maybe kind of similar to what we do here in the Midwest? Or would that interfere with the grape harvesting system?
Yeah, so I touched on it a little bit. It's mostly to keep the ones that let it grow into bushes. The crown becomes a catch-all for leaves and nuts, and so you can't get those out of that crown very well. And some people do it, but they definitely lose a little bit there. And with the catch pans on the harvester, the way they open up, the smaller diameter trunk, or a nice tight clean trunk, will give you the best results and the highest capture rate.
Gotcha. Fantastic. Another question here. I can see that having animals would be a food safety challenge if you're harvesting from the ground. But with your grape harvester, you're not. Maybe the rules should be challenged, or is that even a concern of yours, even with harvesting right off of the trees?
Uh, yeah, well, I think it should be challenged. If like you were saying, if you're using a machine that's picking them up directly from the tree, so you're not even touching the ground, I I would say it's a point of contention of argument with them. But as it is right now, and I'm not super familiar with the way all the rules are, it's an all or nothing from what I understand.
So another question here is when would you do the pruning of your trees?
So um, yeah, so what we're finding, and this is Italy's probably got the best information out there on it, but we're finding that our plan is, because we haven't done too much pruning. We've done a little bit of just training, pruning to train the tree. But what we're finding is to do an alternate pruning. So prune on one year, you prune on the for instance, the west side of the tree, and then the alternate year you prune on the east side of the tree. And so that way you don't cut too much of your tree at once, and it'll stimulate growth, but at the same time preserve your crop.
Fascinating. Okay, interesting. Let's see here. Sabina asks, "Hey, I wonder if anyone has been able to collect seed from old hazelnut plants that survive the blight, almost like survival of the fittest, I guess." Um,
So yeah, I don't know. I think they've worked with that. And the main reason we don't have blight here is nothing to do with the trees. It's just the climate.
because it's so dry.
Correct.
Okay, okay. Question here: what do you do for weed control and fertility since you're organic?
So there's organic compost that we've used, and for the fertility part. There's also some organic fertilizers, but we have not used those. We've just um, been pretty minimal with our nutrient addition. As far as weed control, we just do a grass in between the row and mow it, so it's mechanical. And then for next to the tree and for suckering and getting the weeds there, we use flaming, so propane burners to go through and I do a quick flame. Um, so everything we do is essentially mechanical.
Gotcha. Okay. A question here specific to harvesting. So, what would your typical harvest speed be going through with the grape harvester?
Okay, again, our machine is ancient, and there's much newer, faster machines out there, but our machine would be about walking pace.
Well, now there's a pretty big difference between my walking pace and maybe Dave Bonoff's walking pace. So,
So
but
maybe like 3 miles an hour, 2 to 3
okay,
miles an
okay,
hour.
fair enough, sure. Um, is is there a Western Washington Hazelnut Association, or are there any hazelnuts grown south of Seattle?
Uh, yes, I'm not familiar with them. I don't think there's very much acreage, and I don't want to speak or sound like I know what I'm talking about on what's growing over there. I do know there's some hazelnuts. I'm not aware of an association, and there's some been long time farms in the, I think, like Bellingham, Linden, Blaine area. So that would be northwest Washington State, and they've grown there. Their climate's very similar to the Willamette, Oregon Valley or climate, and so from what I understand, they also have issues with blight and some other things that Oregon has as well.
Great. Another question here: has anyone been importing pollen from Oregon?
Uh, there's been some efforts made to work with pollination. We're still working with that, and it's probably a little early for me to say too much about it. But it's something we're looking at and see for timing and try to encourage, to make sure we're getting optimum production. And so we are looking at that, but it's probably a little early for me to say anything about it.
Sure, sure. Okay. Another question here. You mentioned challenges with buying plants from Oregon and implied that you are now getting them locally. And so, does that mean that there are local nurseries producing those plants? And if so, what methods are they using for propagation, or is it growers taking that initiative?
So there's a local farmer, and they have their company is Blue Sky Hazelnuts, and uh, they grow. I can't remember how many acres they have planted in the ground, but it's the where you have a mother plant in the ground, and then you let it grow up, and they reroot, and then you cut them off the ground, harvest those, and then the mother plant always stays in the ground, and then it grows back up again to repeat the cycle.
So a
It's a
layering
pretty,
technique,
it's a bedding,
perhaps.
layering beds technique, and it's kind of an old school. It's what it's been done for years.
And of course, you're then getting a seedling, but a clone of that mother plant. And then
Correct.
are they focusing on some of those same varieties you just talked about? The Ennis, the McDonald, the Yamhill.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Ennis, Yamhill, Sacagawea, McDonald, I believe, are the ones that they're primarily growing.
Okay. Great. Great. Another question on pollination. How is the pollen being spread with that artificial pollination?
I'm aware of a few different techniques that they've been using, but I will say it's very similar to what, if you're familiar with any other pollinization for like apple trees or cherry trees. So they're using, vehicles that will spread it throughout the orchard. But yeah, there's nothing too terribly new in that realm, or too special for between apples or hazelnuts, from what I understand. But I know, again, very little about that, but I do know there's people that are kind of working with that within our group.
Cool. Well, here's a question that I'm curious about, Piper. Do you get snow there?
We do, yeah. So not necessarily every year, but we usually will get uh, anywhere from maybe 12 inches to 24 inches annually.
Okay. And then you have the receiving station and most of that equipment sitting on a concrete pad out there, but then do you have some sort of a shed where again you're storing most of these? Or you said they go into the poly sacks, but like what's that time frame? Do they all get within a month or so from harvest sent off to the crackers, or are you sitting on stuff right now? Or
Nope. Yeah. So we are not set up for doing any long-term storage. So as soon as we get it into the super sacks, within a week or two, we try to get it
okay.
over to the person that does the processing, and they handle it and store it from there and try to get it worked right away. As you know, right now we're not dealing with enough tonnage for that to be an issue yet, and so we do have plans. We're going to convert some grain storage into, once the product is dry, we can put it into grain storage locations.
I saw that some grain bins on the farm there. So you just
Correct.
use regular augers and all of that standard equipment to move stuff around?
Not all, not there's going to have to be some. It's not a complete switch over crossover, but yeah, the idea is the same.
Cool, cool. Are you growing your apples conventionally, and how does that work alongside organic hazels?
So the apples aren't close to the hazelnuts, geographically speaking, and all our apples are growing non-organic, conventional. We have tried doing some organic in the past. We were not very successful with it, and that's more of an us thing than it is an organic thing. Some people are real successful at it. We just were not successful with it with the apples. So really, I don't think there's an issue. I think it's what we learned. It's extremely difficult to really stay on top of trying to do apples organically. Hazelnuts a lot more forgiving.
Nice. I think we've hit most things. Speak up, folks, if you have a question or you'd like some more information. Oh, as a follow-up to that, would there be any issue with your organic certification if part of the operation wasn't fully organic? How does that work in Washington?
So we used a private entity to certify it organic, but it's the same if you were to use a state agency or whatever. But the block is isolated in the sense that
Ah,
there's no other crops nearby, and if there are, then we keep buffer zones near them. So long as they have I think it's a 40-foot buffer, there's no conflict with um, your non-organic crops, as long as you maintain that buffer zone all the time.
cool, cool. Oh, someone wants to know, when are the summer tours and winter conference scheduled for? Maybe some folks are interested in a trip out to Washington State.
Summer tour has not been announced yet, so sometimes we typically they're right around harvest time,
Okay.
and sometimes we also do it a little bit more mid-season. So we, depending on what we're trying to teach, whether it's maybe pruning, or if it's something more to do with related to harvesting, then we'll do it either pre-harvest or post-harvest. That date has not been announced yet. And winter meeting would be, that's typically for our local membership. And so the thing to attend would be for like a summer tour. People want to see what we're doing.
Cool. Well, let's stay in touch. I put out the Nutty News Bulletin, and so we'll print that on the Nutty News Bulletin and get that out to folks. And maybe you'll see some Midwesterners there.
Oh, sure thing. Would love to.
Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. So, oh, question here. Are you doing private label or simply feeding into the existing commodity market?
So, well, let's assume it's not a personal question. So personally, no, we're just kind of, I don't really care where our nuts go at this point. But there are definitely some members, growers in our area that are doing their own private label and doing their own marketing and looking at avenues for distribution within themselves. So right now, all options are open.
Okay, great. A question here on what you use for N fertilizer to be organic. You did, I don't think you said you did much fertility, but is there any stuff in particular
Yeah,
you
we have
would
not
use,
used
or?
any we have not used any organic, like conventional, or I don't know, I guess a conventional fertilizer. Everything we've used has been basically cow manure compost that actually has an organic
Yeah.
certification.
Gotcha. Oh, here's one I missed. How do you separate leaves and sticks out? And well,
That's by
actually,
the grace
that's
of God. I think that's a difficult question.
well, there's almost two areas there. There's the husking portion of it, right? But then there's
Correct.
later on with the trommels where we saw the kind of one bin with the blank nuts and the sticks and whatnot.
Right. So the real short version is we thrash it, we break it down, make a huge mess, and then we separate the particles in it, and pieces. Nuts come out in one area, and all the other stuff goes out in another, separate area.
Gotcha. Okay. Oh, question, a follow-up on maybe some of those other growers that may be doing their own sort of marketing or direct marketing, any sort of size harvest volume that some of those private label growers are able to do. Um, any insight to that, or would you know any? I mean,
It varies. I mean, there's one of the smaller growers. He might only have a few thousand pounds because he's only. In fact, I know he only had a few thousand pounds because he only had a couple acres, and there's some others that are going to try to be doing, maybe 10,000 pounds worth of themselves. So right now everything's really early, so I can't. Everything's evolving pretty quick.
sure.
So right now everyone's kind of trying whatever they can and kind of feeling out new markets and different things. And so we're kind of encouraging an all the above approach, and we're hoping, that it's going to work out for everyone.
Yeah. Fantastic. Or like when you put in your yam hills, were they mound layers? Were they liners from nurseries with micropropagation?
Mound layers.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, not from micropropagation.
Okay. Hey, Piper, you've been very generous with your time. And so I really want to thank you. I think we've come to the end of most of the questions here. Thanks everyone for joining us to learn a little bit about how things are out there in Washington State. This has been Voices Beyond the Midwest. And really, again, thanks, Piper. And with that, I want to remind folks that we have another grower that we're going to be visiting with tomorrow night, John Kelsey from West Virginia. And John and I had a great conversation, and he is growing some of the the Oregon varieties as well as others. And he's got just a little bit different way of doing things. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.